Sai. I'm very, very excited about today's share, and it's going to be very interesting. The Olim have asked for demonstrations, live demonstrations. We'll see if we can get to that. But what I want to do today is just go to a little bit of history. It's always good to understand a bit of history. And Klal Yisrael like their drink, because we know that everything generally that comes together with a simcha comes together with a cup of wine. There's always alcohol at every Jewish event. That's just how it is. That's what Jews like. That's what we like to do. And therefore, it's important for us to understand at least once, what are the issues of drinking whiskey? Now, the truth is there are a number of issues, and I'm not going to discuss all of them. One of the most famous ones obviously being chometz, right? Because obviously whiskey is chometz, and the shaila is whether or not, if it's owned by a Jew, is it chometz shavuot Pesach? Is it really chometz, not chometz? I don't want to go into the chometz sugya. I want to go into the sugya of kashrus as it applies to many of our whiskeys. So many people are familiar with the idea that there's a whiskey and there's like a kosher whiskey, and there are certain whiskeys that people don't drink. And the question is, why don't they drink them? Not many of us are familiar with exactly how whiskey is made in order to understand fully why it should be mutter or should be asa, and obviously what are the shitas of the poskim lemaisa that discuss it. And another thing, what has changed since the Gedolim have written their tshuvas in the process of making whiskey? Which is why I think it's important to understand. Today we're going to do a little bit of an introduction, and that is going to be exactly how whiskey is made. And again, this is important to know for the process of understanding why it could be a problem of kashrus. Okay, so let's start with a few interesting ideas. First of all, the name whiskey. Where does the name whiskey comes from? So the name whiskey actually comes from a Scottish phrase by the actual means water of life. Right? It comes from a Scottish phrase, water of life. In France, in fact, any hard drink is called ardeve. What does ardeve mean? Water of life. Vodka basically means small water. That's what vodka means. But that's where the name whiskey really comes from in this yesod. Now, you have to understand that whiskey used to come mainly from Ireland. There were approximately 2,000 distilleries in Ireland until the Scots took it over and they made Scottish whiskey, of which now I think, as far as they know, there's only 2 distilleries left in Ireland. Could be there's more at the moment. I haven't checked it recently, but from when I went into it, there are only 2 left over. From originally there were 2,000, and now there are only 2 because the Scots have basically taken that over. Now, it's important to know exactly as follows. Only whiskey that is distilled and aged in Scotland for a minimum of 3 years can actually be called legally Scotch whiskey. Now, there are other conditions as well. Let me give you some of these conditions. Condition number 1 is it has to be distilled with water that is matured from barley and fermented with yeast only. Number 2, it has to be distilled to a 94.8 alcohol strength. Number 3, it has to be matured and strengthened in oak cask for 3 years. We'll get to that. Number 4, nothing other than water and caramel can be added for the coloring or anything else. And number 5, it has to be bottled at a minimum of 40% alcohol. Now, as we know, for those of you that have drunk whiskey in my house, that the cask strength whiskey is a lot more than 40%. As we know that from the green bottles, from the Scottish Whisky Association, that the cask strength is often close to 60, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. But the minimum it has to be is 40% in that case. But it has to be a minimum of 3 years aged and distilled in Scotland for it to be called Scotch whisky. Now, there are 2 types of Scotch whisky. There's a single malt and there's a blended whiskey. Now, over 90% of Scottish whiskey sold around the world is actually blended whiskey. Now, the main ingredients for whiskey, and again, obviously we're going to go into this a little bit more when we talk about this tomorrow, the kashrus problems that come up, but the main ingredients of a malt whiskey is malted barley, water, and yeast. The law does permit caramel to be added for color. That's ingredient number 4. And the 5th ingredient is obviously thyme. That's what it is. Now, American whiskey, bourbon, for those of you people that don't appreciate good whiskey, and you drink bourbon. What is bourbon made from? It's made from maize, oats, rye, and a little bit of barley. And that's how it's fermented. Now, what is the difference between the various names? Now, we're going to go through this a lot tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to give you a list of names that you have to look out for when you're looking at a label of whiskey to understand what could be a potential problem. But before we get to the problems, let's just talk about the basics. A single malt. What is the single malt? A single malt basically means it was produced in one distillery. That's what a single malt actually means. Now, by the way, that doesn't mean it has only one type of whiskey. It can have up to 40 types of whiskey in that blend. But it was only produced in one distillery. That's a single malt. Whereas a malt means that it was a whiskey made from malted barley only. And a pure malt basically means that it was a blend of various malt whiskies, but there's no grain whiskies. And a blended whiskey means it's a combination of anywhere between 30 and 50 distilleries. Again, even if it's made in one distillery, doesn't mean it's one type of whiskey. It can have up to 40 types of whiskey blended together. But if it's a blended whiskey, it means they took different whiskies from different distilleries up to 50, between 30 and 50. Generally, that's how it is. The more malt in the whiskey, generally, the more expensive it is, whatever. Now, let's just talk right here in the ingredients again. And there's a big difference between Scottish whiskey and Irish whiskey, and this is enough kamina lagabi the halacha as well. The Scottish whiskey can only use, as we said, basically 5 ingredients: grain, malted barley, yeast, water, caramel, and thyme, basically. And okay, I guess the wood of the barrel, which we'll talk about. Malted barley is the enzyme that helps the sugar turn from the grain to turn into alcohol, and you can use anything as an enzyme. By the way, even basa v'cholav sometimes. So a malted barley is a natural enzyme. So Scottish whiskey can only be made from a natural enzyme, meaning malted barley, whereas the Irish version can be made from any of the above, which is why Irish whiskey you have to be much more careful, because Irish whiskey does not have the same restrictions as Scottish whiskey. Because in Ireland you're allowed to, for example, add many flavorings. Some distilleries actually add wine, right? Which is obviously even more than a shayla that we're going to be discussing tomorrow about the sherry casks. But they actually in Ireland allowed to be add wine in that case, and therefore Irish whiskey can actually be more of a problem than Scottish whiskey. As far as I'm aware of, the London Based Inn currently gives a hachsha on only one Irish whiskey. I don't know what it's called, but as far as I know, it's only one. Maybe now it's been a while since I looked into it properly, but from when I looked into it, they only give a hachsha on one. So therefore, that's why you have to know the difference in an Irish whiskey and a Scottish whiskey, because the Irish whiskey could have additions to it which are automatically going to be posing a problem of kashrus. Now, let's go now we understand a little bit of the differences between the different names and some of the ingredients that go in it. Let's talk about the process, and that will lead us, Be'ez Hashem, to tomorrow's share, which will be talking about the situation of sherry casks, how it came about, where did it come from, and does it actually pose a kashrus issue. So, first of all, let's go like this. How is a single malt made? So barley, as we know, has a lot of starch in it, and it's eventually converted into sugar. And that produces the alcohol. Barley is soaked in tanks for approximately 2 to 3 days. It's spread on the floor of a building called a malting house. They call it the germination. And over here, there are various heat and things. It takes between 8 and 21 days for this process to happen. Now, once the barley has basically sprouted enough, it's taken into a smoke room called a kiln, a smoke room, and it dries out over there. And this, according to how it's done, can give the whiskey that smooth flavor. When you drink a whiskey, you're like, oh, that's really, really smooth. That depends on the smoke room, on the kiln. How much of it is over there, how much smoke is over there, all sorts of things. Eventually, the crisp, dry barley is ground into a mill. Basically, it's like a flour type grain. Now, hot water is now added to what we call the grist. That's the pieces, and it depends on the quality of the water, right? Now, we learned that when we went to the Thinker's Distillery here in Eretz Yisrael, so they gave us a whole sugya about how they produce the water for the vodka, right? None of us have realized that the water that you use for the water makes such a nafkamina, and it is. It does make a big difference. Again, the water, Scottish water, happens to be very pure, it comes from a good place, and therefore it's very, very good, which is one of the reasons that people make it over there. But the nafkamina of the water that they use and the quality of the water will make a major difference in the result, and that's why Scottish water, as I said, is very, very pure. It's famous for that, right? People that have ever gone to Scotland, I'm sure you've been to Scotland, right? It's a very, very nice. The air is nice, the water is fresh, it's clean, it's got a nice environment, and therefore that obviously produces the best whiskey. So we have the malt and the water that's now put into a vessel called the mash. And it's basically stirred for a few hours and repeatedly, and they increase the temperature each time. Fermentation, right? So it's cooled and it's sent to a huge vat called the washback. And that's the liquid all now is sent to these wooden tanks. The brewer's yeast is now added to that. And the fermentation now begins, which means that the yeast turns into sugar, turns the sugar into alcohol. It takes approximately 2 days for that to happen. And at this stage, the alcohol content is somewhere between 5 and 10%. Now, basically, the way that we're discussing right now is basically the same way they make beer. There's no major difference. Just when it comes to beer, they obviously add hops at this stage. Now, that's the fermentation. The distillation now has to be diluted, which means the liquid that goes over there has to be diluted, which separates the alcohol from other substances. In Scotland, it's distilled twice. In Ireland, it's distilled 3 times. It's here that it's heated up, and the alcohol content comes approximately 20%. Now, until now, we basically have no real problems when it comes to kashrus. Nothing we said, no ingredients that were added was a sugya of kashrus, okay? So let's just discuss this a little bit. We're going to start the sugya now, and then tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, we'll try to continue it and try to make it a lot more nageya. Now, there are many, many processes that go affect the final taste of the whiskey. The oak cask, that's where the maturation takes place, is the most important contribution. It's over here that it gets the real rich flavor and the color, right? When it's basically clear like vodka. At this stage that we've been discussing, it's basically like a vodka. But it's when you put it in the oak cask, that's when it starts to get not only the flavor, but also gets its very goldeny, nice color. Now, wood, as we know, is porous. The Gemara in Psachim talks about kashering wood. A lot of people think for some reason that you can't kasher wood. The Gemara in Psachim says that you can. You can kasher wood. It's porous like everything else. It absorbs, and therefore if it absorbs, it also gives out. That's the yesod. Now, over time, wood basically breathes air from the environment, and if it's stored next to the sea or near the mountains where the air and the humidity is very different, that will actually influence the flavor of the whiskey. In fact, they bring down that between 60 and 70% of the flavor of whiskey is attributed to the oak cask that it was stored in. It will all depend where you place the cask. Will you put it near the sea? Will you put it near the mountains, where the different air environments will actually affect the wood, because the wood is porous. It breathes in the air and therefore gives it out to the whiskey. So that will have a direct effect on everything over there. Now, it's interesting that the wood is actually full of natural oils called vinolins, and during the maturing process, the spirit draws out these vinolins out from the wood, and they actually add flavor to the whiskey. Now, as we said, Scotch whiskey, good Scottish whiskey, has to be left a minimum of 3 years to mature by law in order to be called Scotch whiskey. But some of the good ones are obviously left a lot more than that, 10, 12, 18, whatever it is, 60, whatever you want to say, and it depends, obviously it depends on the blend, and it depends how many years that it is left over there, and the based on the consistency, based on the cask, will be dependent on the flavor, and the general outcome, as we mentioned also earlier as well, is between 40 and 46% of an alcoholic time when it comes in that way. Now, basically what we have to get to, which I said we're going to get to tomorrow, is the sugya of understanding what the cask can do and what the different castes that they found in this sort of sugya. And then Be'ez Hashem tomorrow we'll go to and understand what were the differences, where did the shilas come up, because until now there are no shilas of kashrus. Tomorrow Be'ez Hashem we're going to talk about the actual problems that come up Be'ez Hashem. Okay, join us tomorrow for part 2, very, very important.